Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start loot. This is before frozen moonlight. No thief likes a full moon. Like mushrooms and owls, they do their best work in the dark. There it is, a fat, satisfied moon, bright and silvery white, tracing a line on the dark lake that leads right to three thieves who have paused to examine the loot. It has been the perfect heist. In and out, a hot knife through sweet butter. Months of planning, practice runs, disagreements that ballooned into fights. Two of the thieves are barely speaking to the third. In the end, it didn't matter. In the end, they got the goods. A priceless emerald brooch owned by Catherine the Great. The crack in the sky, the world's most famous turquoise. The 60-carat make-piece diamond, said to be the most brilliant gem in the history of the world. The stones are all notorious, cursed, rumored to have caused more deaths, bankruptcies, suicides, and indigestion than any moldering mummy could even hope to inspire. The owner of all these jewels? Carlotta Grimstone, one of the richest women on the planet. Early on in her career as a socialite, she found herself competing with prettier, sillier girls for attention. She liked getting her picture in the paper. So, with Daddy's permission, she decided to make a name for herself by collecting all the world's cursed stones. She even dressed up a nickname and hired a publicist to drop it in any media that would listen and print it. But fate's temptress never stuck. Thieves don't believe in curses. How can something worth so much be cursed? It's a ticket to a sweet life. The only people who say money can't buy happiness are the poor suckers shining a billionaire's shoes. The stones wink at them from a flat rock, catching the moonlight. Hello, sweet life, they're all thinking. But even a perfect heist has its pitfalls. The third thief has violated their agreement. He has snatched up a pretty necklace for his girlfriend. It's a bauble, not nearly worth what the other stones are. He wants to keep it. There are objections. They don't know what these 7 moonstones of the necklace are worth, but they look unusually fine. Since he violated the terms of the heist, why should he get the spoils? Fine, the third thief says, snatching up the necklace and twirling it around his finger in an arc. Then fence it with the others. Sell it to another crook for less than it's worth if that makes you happy. The clasp breaks, the gold links falling away, and the moonstones seem to hover in the air. How is that possible? Before falling onto the rocky beach. The stones form a perfect circle. It's as though drops of moonlight have frozen on the ground. They glow with a light that is not quite blue, not quite white, not quite silver. It is the most beautiful sight the 3 thieves have ever seen. So beautiful they cannot move. They can't look away. Then comes a shock to their bodies, so electric it takes their breath. Dread runs through them like ice through rock. They might shatter from it. The third thief sees himself captured. You will be caught tonight and made to pay. The second thief receives a death sentence, death by water before the moon is set. The first thief sees the worst vision of all. Before the passage of 13 years, the 2 birthed together will die. Together. The sound of a helicopter wakes them up out of what feels like a trance. The searchlight sweeps the water and the path of light hits the beach. It lands on the third thief. He snarls the curses that people who have been unlucky enough to find themselves caught use. He blames the other 2. Betrayed! With quicker reflexes, the other 2 have dived behind a boulder, flattened against it, pressing themselves into shadow. The third thief, the angry one, is closest to the emerald brooch and the crack in the sky. The make-piece diamond rolls away from his fingers. He grabs the other 2 gems and runs full tilt toward any shadow he can find. The searchlight follows him. The circle of moonstones is just inches away from the 2 thieves. Pressed against the shadow, one thief dares to reach out and scoop up the stones. The 2 dash through the boulders toward the line of trees. They have practiced this route many times, and they know it well. Through the woods, around the lake, to the cliff. They scramble up the cliff quickly, knowing each handhold. Vaulting over the top, they race to cover the pines. They slip into the entrance of the cave. Even in the early summer, the cave glitters with ice. The mist cools their skin. They know each other so well, they don't need to exchange a word. One glance does it. Coincidence. It won't happen to us. No such thing as prophecies. How can you be so sure? Because I'm rational. According to who? You're standing in an ice cave with a bag of moonstones and the police are after you. That's rational? It's amazing what you can do with your eyes. The fall of water against the cave wall is like a mirror reflecting darkness. They drop on their hands and knees and half crawl, half slither through a crack in the wall. They inch out slowly to the open air. They are high above the lake now. The thunder of the waterfall surprises them, so much more powerful than they'd seen before. The stones under their feet are slick and glitter with ice. The second thief turns, smiles, is ready to say something, slips on the slick, wet rock. This is not part of the plan. The thief goes over backward, swept into the torrent. The first thief's cry is an anguished howl. Chapter 1. Now. Pocketful of stones. Never trust a guy who says, "Trust me." Never give your real name to a cop. Never let someone steal your getaway car. It was the last piece of his father's advice that March McQuinn found himself contemplating at 3 a.m. on a picturesque bridge over a dark canal in Amsterdam. Only it wasn't a getaway car, it was a getaway bike, and someone had pinched it. Just about the worst thing you can do to a thief is steal his stuff. March was especially indignant. He'd actually paid for that bike. He checked the time on his cell. He felt the pressure in his drumming pulse, but he wasn't about to panic. He just had to steal a bike. In about 7 minutes, his old man, world-famous cat burglar Alfred McQuinn, was going to have a fistful of diamonds and be looking for an exit. That would be March. Mist curled along the surface of the canal. All the good citizens of Amsterdam were snoring underneath their eiderdowns. The weeping edges of a yellow moon dissolved and reformed on dark water as the flow of the tide moved through. March intently scanned the row of bicycles chained to the railing, searching for his target. Timing is everything, bud. The difference between $1 million and 25 to life can come down to 30 seconds. The red one with the basket and the combination lock called to March, "Steal me!" Battered fenders, but the chain was oiled and the tires were good. There were roughly 64,000 different number sequences possible on one combination lock. He could find the correct one in a minute flat. All it took was the right touch. March felt for the slight drag as the chamber hit the number again. Got it. Then counterclockwise. Clockwise again. The lock swung open. He took the time to let out a long, shaky breath. If he messed up, Alfie would forgive him, but he'd never forgive himself. He threw his brown paper sack in the basket. The cover story had been decided on a week ago. If he got stopped by a cop, he was bringing his night watchman father his breakfast. There was bruin butter mit kuss, brown bread and cheese, and an apple in the sack. Remember, the right prop can save a shaky cover story. March flew over the bridge, legs pumping hard. He'd been over the route many times. He had walked it with Alfie, both of them munching on herring sandwiches, looking like what Alfie called ham and eggers. The normal American tourists their fake passports claimed they were. Dan Sherwood from Syosset, Long Island, and his son Dan Jr. Then he'd ride it half a dozen times with Alfie timing him. They'd gone over every detail, and nothing could go wrong. Even though Alfie always said, "If you think nothing can go wrong, you better think again." He flew down the last street and turned the corner. The Grand Hotel rose up from the canal like a tanker about to sail the North Sea. He cut the bike toward the rear courtyard, bumped over the cobblestones to the loading dock, and skidded to a stop only a minute late. Any second, his pop should be shimmying down the drain pipe and tossing him the jewels. Trying to slow the urgent racing of his heart, he scanned the facade of the hotel. No pop. When trying to spot Alfred McQuinn, it was always smart to check the roof. March craned his neck and looked up. Alfie was just a dark shadow moving along the dormers, high above the cobblestone courtyard. The first faint alarm began to ding inside him. There was improvisation in even the tightest plan, but something must have gone wrong, unless his timing was off. He checked his cell again. March glanced back up, and this time Alfie was looking down at him. He had a secret signal when they bumped into each other accidentally in public, and Alfie didn't want March to acknowledge him. He would smooth left over his left eyebrow. It meant, "I'm working. Get out of here." But why now? Had something gone wrong? Alfie's hand moved. He tossed something off the roof. It seemed to catch the moonlight, then hover and spin, something bright and bluish-white and as small as a star. Before he had time to think, March ran toward it. It seemed to fall in slow motion, and he felt as though he had all the time in the world to catch it. He opened the paper bag, and it fell inside with the slightest little ping. March looked inside to see what it was. It was the smallest space of a moment, that beat of a heart that counted, because the next time he looked up, his father was falling. Chapter 2. Floating, Falling. Alfie fell backward through the air, face to the night sky, as though he had said to himself, "The heck with climbing down, think I'll just float." The dropping seemed to take forever. March felt his cry explode from his gut, but it stayed inside. All his life, he'd been trained not to express emotion in public unless it was manufactured, part of a plan. The sound of the landing was like no sound March had ever heard. It seemed like a sound a watermelon would make, or a plastic jug of water, not a person. March ran. The last few inches he slid on his knees against the stones, stone against bone. Pop! Alfie seemed strangely unbruised, filling March with hope. Then he noticed the blood pooling behind his father's head. Alfie's hand came up, fingers fluttering like a sputtering candle. March reached for that hand to still those fingers. He had never seen his father with shaking hands. Jewel thieves don't have hands that tremble. March. He swallowed against the fear that constricted his throat. Pop, Wait. A month. What? Alfie coughed a terrible, awful sound, thick and bubbling. Promise. A month. Then find Jules. Each word came out as a small puff of air. Stick. Rag. With what seemed like enormous effort, his father touched March's cheek and his hair. Follow the falls today. Don't die, March pleaded. Please don't die. No. Blood frothed and came out of Alfie's mouth. His eyes were unfocused now, staring up at the moon. March collapsed back on his heels. He didn't believe in this moment. He hung suspended in it, but it wasn't real. Surely he could change it. He could return to himself on the bridge. He could pedal faster, and then he'd have time to yell, "Don't slip!" or "Watch out!" March heard a siren, that European whee-oh, whee-oh sound, and footsteps running and stopping behind him. The moment was over. Time had ticked on, and it took him to a place where his father was dead. Behind him, there were sudden fragments of sound and movement. A half circle of people talking in hushed voices. The doorman. A couple of kitchen workers. The ambulance drew up. A police car squealed to a halt. The officers were here. You see a uniform, you scram. March stumbled away as the ambulance workers ran over. He kept backing up, his eyes on the medics. He watched them bend over the body, shine a light in Alfie's eyes, feel for a pulse, get out equipment. They cut away Alfie's jacket, and diamonds spilled out of his pockets. The small crowd gasped. The police perked up. March saw the instant the medics gave up. Two of them exchanged a glance, and one shook his head. Their movement slowed, and one of them started to put equipment away. There was no need to hurry now. A terrible anguish filled his chest and pressed against his heart. More talking in Dutch. The circle around Alfie was growing. A couple of hotel guests had heard the commotion and come out. Tomorrow would be a story, how a man with diamonds in his pockets fell down from the sky. One policeman squatted over the body. He said a name with great excitement. Alfred McQuinn. And then someone in the circle, the guy in the white apron, the baker, trying to be helpful, was pointing, and March picked out a word he knew. Jongen. Boy. By the time someone pointed again, it was to the air. Chapter 3. Where is the boy? Boy alone on the street, 3 o'clock a.m. Don't run, don't be seen. Keep close to the buildings. Keep your eyes open, move fast. Panic doesn't get you anything except arrested. If you get stopped, remember your cover story. March had lost the map in his head. The route he'd memorized was gone. The streets suddenly looked all the same, with their narrow houses, with sharply peaked roofs and tidily painted doors. Yellow, blue, red, black. There wasn't a straight line in Amsterdam. All the buildings seemed to tilt. It felt to March as though they would tumble down on him, a shower of bricks and window boxes full of tulips. Where is the boy? Nothing felt real except the pavement against the soles of his sneakers. How hard it had been for his father to touch his cheek. How much strain on his face. How much determination. When the gesture had been done so casually so many times. A hand on his shoulder, a kiss on the top of his head. He'd never feel that again. March saw the days ahead of him, so many days and years when he wouldn't feel that hand. March's knees gave way. He sat on the sidewalk. He knew he shouldn't. No doubt some stray insomniac would look outside his bedroom window, and his proper Dutch mind would want to get help for the boy collapsed in the middle of the sidewalk, holding his head with both hands. Tears dripped through his fingers. He scrubbed them away. Shock made everything so sharp, and yet so far away. The paper bag sat in his lap. In it was the cheese sandwich they were going to split for breakfast back at the flat. March thought of the many things his father loved and would never eat again. Herring sandwiches and American potato chips and licorice, things he said they'd do together. See a Yankees game, spend a month in New Zealand, go to a museum without playing the What Would You Steal and How game. March tossed the bag aside, hating the sandwich because Alfie would never eat it. The stone tumbled out, aglow in the moonlight. It was the last thing his father had given him. Maybe it was worth something. Or else, why had Alfie thrown it, knowing March would catch it, because his son never let him down? Just yesterday, he'd said it. You never let me down, March. March gripped the stone hard. Don't let him down then. Keep moving. It took only a block before he knew he was being followed. And while I was reading, I got a special visitor, so hold on a minute. Say hi, guys. Joy's enjoying the story too. Okay, we'll see you later. Let's try this. Chapter 4. Me and My Shadow. It wasn't as easy as footfalls behind him. No, someone was following him, but someone was very, very good at it. You couldn't be the son of a master thief if you didn't grow a sixth sense. Panic shimmered through his body, tiny hammers hitting glass. He could shatter, he felt, in a moment, and he gulped the air, trying to calm himself. The guy waited to turn corners until March did. As March crossed a canal and started down the other side, he stayed as close as he could between the boats and the parked cars on the side of the canal. With water to amplify the echoes, March heard the footsteps clearly. He walked faster. The pace behind him increased. Police? He didn't think so. He still didn't know where he was, but that didn't matter now. He had to lose whoever it was before he landed to the apartment. But why was someone following him? It didn't make sense, unless he was imagining it. He knew he wasn't. Down one more block, around a corner, looped back, and crossed the canal again. Still, the footsteps followed. He turned a corner around an apartment building and stopped to peer around it. Across the misty water, a figure strolled along the black pathway. March couldn't see a face underneath the black cap, hands in pockets of a loose raincoat. Just a person out for a late-night walk? Coming home from a party? The figure followed the curve of the canal and disappeared around a bend. March waited another minute, suddenly nervous about moving. Which direction should he head? Then he heard the footsteps again, tapping along the brick pathway. This time, his pursuer was on his side of the canal. Panic was now a frantic drumbeat inside him. He pushed off the building and sprinted down the side of the canal. March dodged in between cars, parked at the edge of the canal, and slid into one of the boats tied up alongside. He edged under a tarp that had been tossed next to the cabin. The footsteps continued toward him, down the side of the canal where he had just been. Tap, tap, tap. The person stopped near the boat. He held his breath. Long seconds passed. March's fingers shook as he held the tarp over his head. All sound left the world. The lapping of the water against the hull of the boat, the faint sound of a tram rattling down a street blocks away, his own skittering pulse. He heard nothing now as he strained to hear something, a rustle of a coat, the tapping of the footsteps heading away. Instead, he heard faintly the sound of whistling. A tune March didn't recognize, something eerie that caught on the moonlight and curled along the mist. One long note, one short, then a simple melody. The person stopped whistling abruptly. If March had moved, the person would have heard the rustle. Was that the reason for the abrupt stop, to trap him into revealing himself? A quiet footfall, heading closer. The person was standing right next to the boat. The whistling began again. 2 long notes, then the melody. March raised the edge of the tarp a tiny fraction. The person was pulling on black leather gloves. Why? It wasn't cold. No fingerprints. He jerked in terror, kicking something that clanged softly. The whistling stopped. The light turned on in the cabin below him. He felt through the wood of the deck, 2 feet hitting the floor. Someone called out in Dutch, something angry. The door flew open, and a man came out on deck, shirtless and barefoot. He tripped over the tarp and kicked it in frustration. His bare foot met March's leg. With a roar, he threw the tarp back. March bolted. He had time to register the flash of anger and surprise on the burly man's face, creased with sleep. He felt rather than saw the pursuer standing still and watchful on the pavement. He jumped up on a deck chair, then onto the roof of the cabin, leaped onto the bow, then onto the stern of the next boat, scrambling up on the cabin, bolted down the open boat in front, and with a combination of leap and stumble and scramble, his heart bursting, ran from boat to boat until he was able to leap up to the railing of the bridge, pull himself up and onto it, and look back. The man on the boat stood bare-chested and furious, shaking a fist and shouting in Dutch. A light came on in the house to his left. The hem of a raincoat flapped as his pursuer hurried around a corner and disappeared. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. What next? It took him 3 tries to lock the door of the apartment. He slid down until he was on the floor, back against the door, legs splayed out in front of him. He tucked his hands in his armpits and ordered the caterwaul of panic to slow. It didn't mean someone was following him, he told himself. Someone could have been walking, strolling home. Who wouldn't have run like that when a man started yelling at a crazy kid who ran over boats to get away? He had to stare down his terror. He had to focus on what to do now, whether to hide or whether to run. It wasn't like Alfie was the best father in the world. Not exactly a role model. There had been times over the years when he had pulled off a big job. 2 whole years living in the south of France. Sweet! But mostly, he and March had bounced around Europe with a couple of 6-month stints in New York City and a very pleasant year in Spokane, Washington. March spent 6 months at a Swiss boarding school. They were both miserable. He still remembered the day he came out of class and saw Alfie leaning against the red convertible. "Want to go for a spin?" he'd ask. They'd driven to Spain. So mostly March had been homeschooled, if you could call it that. His education was spotty. He knew the population of Istanbul and how to get around other places, and the names of Beethoven's symphonies, and could tell a Picasso from a Braque, but March couldn't multiply a fraction. He could calculate odds at a racetrack, though. They were together, a team, and there were plenty more good times than bad. March didn't know how to keep going without Alfie. He remained on the floor, back against the door. He was used to being alone, but when alone has the promise of company at the end of it, it isn't quite so lonely. This was as lonesome as the moon, the deep kind of lonesome that held hands with fear. All his life, he'd felt as though something was missing. It would expand and contract inside him, like air inside a balloon. There were times he'd feel the space was so full that he'd turn to say something and be surprised to find there was no one there. Weird stuff. As he got older, he'd figured that the missing space was his mother. She died when he was 2, so maybe some part of his brain remembered her. But maybe all along he knew this feeling was coming for him. This much empty filling him up. The light was getting grayer outside. Soon the day would begin. The news would come on, the papers would hit the coffee houses and cafes, people would open their laptops. The landlady on the first floor would turn on the radio. Alfred McQuinn, world-famous jewel thief on Interpol's most wanted list, was dead. There would be a photograph, the most recent one they had, and the landlady would know that Alfie McQuinn was Dan Sherwood in room 12. And she would call the police. She would say, "He has a son." And then the knock at the door would come, and he'd be in the system. There would be paperwork and social workers and people who know best. March would land back in the States, no doubt about that, because he had an American passport. Well, he had many passports, but only one real one, and that was American. He had no relatives at all. Alfie's parents were dead, and he and March's mom had both been only children. Alfie thought she had family somewhere. Texas or Canada, he'd say, as if the 2 places were the same. But he'd never met them, so that meant foster care. March knew how to navigate airports and train stations, how to pack light, how to move through a city without being noticed, how to order street food in Shanghai and steak in Paris, how to find a cheap apartment. He knew where to go to buy a fake passport in 5 European capitals, and he knew how much it cost. Things he didn't know how to do: sit in the classroom, obey authority, follow rules. Chapter 6. Walking Away Money. Never look back, kid. March gathered his nerve. He knew the drill. He'd watched Alfie do it a few times when they came a little too close to getting caught. March went around the small apartment, gathering up toothpaste and brushes and t-shirts and magazines and tossing them in the garbage bags Alfie always kept. He threw away clothes and shoes. They didn't have much. When they worked on a job, they packed a suitcase. Still, Even the suitcase would be too much to carry. He leaned over to twist the bag shut. One of Alfie's shoes was at the top, and for a moment, March couldn't see straight. The shoe was just as much his father as a face or a smile, and closing out the bag was like shutting a coffin. He stuffed it down out of sight. He walked quietly out of the flat and 3 blocks down and 5 blocks over to a construction site. Alfie always picked an apartment that was near major construction, just in case they needed to throw evidence away. He tossed the garbage bag in the dumpster. Back at the apartment, he went to the closet and took out Alfie's jacket. Navy flannel, custom tailored, purchased in London on Jermyn Street. March was tall for an almost 13-year-old, but the sleeves were too long, and he rolled them up. He stuck his hand in a pocket and just came up with a piece of licorice. He felt along the side of the lining. There was a snap there that concealed a hidden pocket. He put the moonstone inside. Then he reached for the getaway packs. Every thief keeps a getaway pack. It's a simple duffel or backpack with enough to get out of town. Just one bag with the right items in case the police were knocking at the front door and you have to leave by the window. Alfie had a small nylon duffel and March had a backpack. He knew what was in his: a change of clothes, a fake passport, about 200 euros, a disposable cell phone, a toothbrush. March dumped out the contents of Alfie's duffel on the bed: fake passport, prepaid cell phone. He grabbed the kit containing the toothpaste and soap. He unzipped the top, searched behind the lining, and slid out some bills. American dollars and euros. Total, $5,000. That couldn't buy him a new life, but it could take him pretty far. Thanks, Pop. There were also items he hadn't expected. A paperback book. Alfie wasn't much of a reader. A pack of playing cards. A key attached to a touristy New York City keychain. Maybe Alfie had a lease on their next apartment somewhere. New York City? Maybe. Or maybe he just had a stray keychain. He never told March where they were going until they were in the train station or at the airport. March used to think that was fun. Alfie never planned too far ahead. Maybe if he'd been more of a planner, he would have left his son with more of a getaway pack to start over. But Alfie never thought he'd get caught. He had a backup plan for every job, just not for the job of father. March picked up the paperback, The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins, some guy who'd been dead for over 100 years. That was weird. Alfie read newspapers for news and magazines and websites for tips on what jewels celebrities owned. It was amazing the information his dad could glean from those fancy home design magazines, the ones that showed rooms full of furniture, but also windows, doors, and room layouts of the rich and famous. March rifled through the book, and a sheet of paper fell out. It was a list in Alfie's handwriting. Number 1, Particle Zoo. Number 2, Room Service. Number 3, Vacuum Packed. Number 4 and 5, Surfing Murph. Number 6, Wet Paint. Number 7, Plastic Replica. Imaginary band names? March took out his mystified anger on the paper, folding it in quarters and creasing it sharply with a fingernail. He tucked it into the pocket of the jeans. He tossed the book back on the bed. A bookmark fell out. It was a business card. Printed on the front was, "The Stick and Rag Players, Gorilla Spectacular, coming to an abandoned space near you." Stick, rag? Alfie'd said that. Was that what he meant? Seemed funny that his father would tell him about a group of oddball performers with his last breath. "Talk to me, Pop. What's all this crazy stuff? Getaway packs were supposed to have just enough to get out. Are you trying to tell me something?" No answer, just the faint sounds of a sleeping city coming to life outside the window. Scrawled on the back of the business card was a street address in Amsterdam, a date and a time, 10 p.m. The date was tomorrow. March looked out the window at the pink blush on the gray clouds. No, today. He glanced at the getaway packs tossed in the bed. He knew that this random stuff had to have some meaning. It wasn't like Alfie to overpack. He hadn't left those things as a guide for his son, but somehow they would have to be. He could walk out the door right now. Amsterdam Central Station was only blocks away. He could pick a destination, hop on a train, figure out his next steps as the miles took him far away. Or he could find out what Alfie had been up to.